Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. Gain valuable insights by attending the podcast, then complete the assessment test to download your certificate. To do this, follow these simple steps. Click on the link in your description to access the session. Create a free account and attend the podcast. After the podcast, take the assessment test and download your certificate. It's easy, and it's free. We highly recommend checking out our subscription. Let's get started.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that's a fantastic journey. And, you've been at the front row seat of how CPA partnerships drive growth, right? So how has that experience shaped your M&A strategy today?
Yeah, great question. So I would say at the end of the day, it really helped me build trust with people and understand how to walk someone through the relationship process. As you know, Saul, the average accountant, I say this respectfully, is not very outgoing or entrepreneurial, right? They're more process driven, right? They look at a tax return and they follow the instructions and then they fill out that tax return. So that really helped me understand that side of the business. I would say the average financial advisor is more of a type A personality, the go-getter type personality, where the average CPA is almost the antithesis of that, right? So I really learned how to bridge that gap so that accountants understood that we are doing this on behalf of the client. At the end of the day, if we can help provide your client a better outcome with our advice, it literally is a win-win scenario, right? Not only do we help the client, but you at the end of the day look like an all-star, in the accounting space. So it really helped me learn the intricacies behind building a relationship with somebody. And I think a lot of people think that, M&A is all about the money and the transaction. That's part of it, but actually it's more of a relationship-driven outcome. It's not necessarily a financially driven outcome, because at the end of the day in financial services, if you're working with a qualified party who is buying your business, the money will be there, right? No one is essentially paying below market multiples and winning all these deals.
Welcome back to another episode of Accounting M&A Insider. I'm your host, Saul, and today we are diving into a space that's not only reshaping wealth management, but also redefining how CPA firms think about growth and succession. My guest today is Joe Greco, Managing Director at Elite Advisor Successions. Joe has a fascinating journey. He cut his teeth at Cut-in Wealth Management, the number one practice in Ameriprise, where he sourced over $400 million in organic opportunities and more than $60 million in asset under management through CPA partnerships. Today, he helps advisors grow through M&A advisory and also design succession strategies to monetize their life's work. Joe, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Yeah, great to see you as well, Saul. It's great to be here. And I saw you just had my good friend Todd Steinberg on your podcast. So it's a small world inside of M&A. So it's good to see that we're all connected here in some way. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. We've been working with Todd for quite a while. So yeah, it is a small world, So thank you for being here. So Joe, let's get started with your journey. You went from Ameriprise top practice to leading Elite Advisor Successions. So can you walk us through that evolution? What really sparked your interest in M&A and succession planning?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Saul. So I started out at Ameriprise, was not the number one practice at the time where I joined, but I was fortunate enough to land a job with Jonathan Cutton, based out of New York at Ameriprise. And I learned a plethora of information working with him. Great guy, great leader, great mentor to me. Very thankful that I had that opportunity. I started out more or less as a junior advisor. And I quickly figured out that path wasn't for me. As you know, Saul, a lot of advisors' income is driven by the markets, right? Because they're managing assets for a fee. The markets go up, the markets go down. And, throughout that time, there were some blips and bloops in the market. And I saw the stress that came with being an advisor and really having your income tied to the stock market, which, as you know, is not really in anybody's control, right? So that was... Yeah. For me, I learned the process. I learned how the relationship process regarding client service, but I ultimately decided that being a financial advisor and necessarily kind of being strapped to the market and clients wasn't necessarily the right role for me. So I started to pivot more into business development. And I was thankful that John really had a nice niche or niche, however you say it, forming CPA partnerships around the country with accounting firms who saw the value in also incorporating some level of financial planning, whether it be an in-house partnership or referral partnership. I really struck a niche there and really found my stride, I guess, prospecting accountants and really having them understand how financial services, tax planning, and estate planning all work together, and really going around the country and figuring out who is going to be a good partner for Cut and Wealth. So what we did is, as we expanded throughout the country, we would essentially reach out to accountants in new areas around the country that we were opening offices in, and basically said, listen, we're now in your area. We'd like to meet with you and really explore a partnership, because ultimately we have clients who from time to time need tax planning services, and we don't provide them in-house, right? That's not something that we aim to do. So reach out to them, essentially form partnerships. Some of them became very fruitful partnerships for us. And at the end of the day, obviously, our goal was to help clients, right? Tax and financial planning work very well together. And as you know, as clients develop more wealth, right, usually you have to do more tax planning for them, more estate planning for them. So all those things start to work together as a client accumulates more wealth throughout their life cycle. So it was a very, very good career path for me. And I was able to learn a lot, not only about wealth management, but accounting, and ultimately how all those things worked well together. Now, as I got more successful with that, I also started to get more into marketing, because obviously marketing also ties into all of that. So I became essentially the marketing director at one point in my career at Cut and Wealth Management. And then I started to get a lot more, I guess, involved in M&A through John, because John started to really become almost a mogul, in M&A and financial services. He did his first practice acquisition back in 2000. And then really after COVID, that accelerated for him, because he was able to meet a lot more advisors over Zoom and virtual meetings. He didn't necessarily have to fly around the country, right, to start doing some of these deals, and really explaining why Cut and Wealth may be the best fit for their practice. So I kind of became John's right-hand man regarding M&A. I learned how he, put the advisors throughout the process. I learned how to structure the deals. And ultimately, I became the managing director of Elite Advisor Successions, with John's blessing, right, to kind of get out of Cut and Wealth in a good way and kind of become more of an agnostic consultant, to understand, hey, maybe Cut and Wealth isn't going to be the right fit for you. But the good thing about Elite Advisor Successions is that we have about 40 buyers across the country who are experienced in M&A. They're well capitalized. So it becomes more of an exercise to say, what is a good fit for you? And we aim to provide a good fit, whether that be the transaction, the client service fit, the geographical fit. We feel like we have a pretty good network here at Elite, to be able to satisfy, for the most part, any seller that we speak with and execute on their succession plan. So I hope all that makes sense.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And that's a fantastic journey. And, you've been at the front row seat of how CPA partnerships drive growth, right? So how has that experience shaped your M&A strategy today?
Yeah, great question. So I would say at the end of the day, it really helped me build trust with people and understand how to walk someone through the relationship process. As you know, Saul, the average accountant, I say this respectfully, is not very outgoing or entrepreneurial, right? They're more process driven, right? They look at a tax return and they follow the instructions, and then they fill out that tax return. So that really helped me understand that side of the business. I would say the average financial advisor is more of a type A personality, the go-getter type personality, where the average CPA is almost the antithesis of that, right? So I really learned how to bridge that gap so that accountants understood that, we are doing this on behalf of the client. At the end of the day, if we can help provide your client a better outcome with our advice, it literally is a win-win scenario, right? Not only do we help the client, but you at the end of the day look like an all-star, in the accounting space. So it really helped me learn the intricacies behind building a relationship with somebody. And I think a lot of people think that, M&A is all about the money and the transaction. That's part of it, but actually it's more of a relationship-driven outcome. It's not necessarily a financially driven outcome, because at the end of the day in financial services, if you're working with a qualified party who is buying your business, the money will be there, right? No one is essentially paying below market multiples and winning all these deals. That's not how the industry works. So the money almost takes care of itself. And then it becomes more about the client service process, the resources of the buyer, the client experience that they're giving their clients, the geographical fit, if necessary. So I learned very quickly working with accountants that it's a lot more about the intangibles and really building the relationship, with the accountant. And that translated well into M&A, because at the end of the day, when I speak with an advisor who's looking to sell their practice, I have to come across as credible to them, right? That I can actually help them and bring their business to market. And that doesn't necessarily have to do anything with money. It has to do with me coming across as a qualified consultant and truly taking the time to have a conversation with them to understand what their vision is behind their business. So, I hope that kind of paints that picture a little bit. Again, I think a lot of people think M&A is all about the money, like you see all these things on, movies and all these things that have come out. Like, again, that's part of it. But really the intricacy comes in behind the relationship. And if you could really match two people who have similar interests, similar visions, similar personalities, etc., that's how deals close. It's not necessarily about leading with the big bucks. That doesn't necessarily move the needle for a lot of people.
No, I agree to you on that. And what I love is that, you aren't just looking at organic growth, but you really took that opportunity to understand how the partnerships, especially with the CPAs, work. Like it's a relationship driven business, and how that they could also leverage in ways that are much different than how advisors overlook it. A lot of them still look at it as a financial transaction, mergers and acquisitions, but it's much more than that. So thank you for highlighting that. Now, let's talk about the state of play in 2025 from your perspective. How has the M&A landscape for advisors and CPA firms evolved over the past few years?
Yeah, great question. So, I think it's no surprise that everyone can see that it's vastly accelerated. I think that's a combination of a few things. We have, obviously the baby boomer generation starting to retire, and most financial advisors are, I think the average advisor, age is about 57 years old, right? So that ties hand in hand with that. You're going to see a lot of baby boomer advisors retiring over the next 10 years. And obviously the need to sell their practice is going to be more front and center. You obviously have private equity coming a little bit heavy-handed into the space, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in the future. Private equity really wasn't involved in financial services 10 years ago, but now they are almost the go-to, right, for a lot of bigger firms, right? So at the end of the day, that's pushed market multiples upwards because you have a lot more competition, from buyers that have very deep pockets, right, that they can overspend and overpay for some of these deals just so that they can actually win them. And it's interesting, typically accounting firms have sold for, I would say for around, again, all over the place, but anywhere from, we'll say, a 1x multiple or so right in their revenue. But also, I think that, not only private equity is starting to kind of view that space as attractive, but now you also have financial advisors who are acquiring accounting firms, because instead of paying
Yes.
3 or 4x top line revenue for a wealth management firm, I think they're starting to realize, well, hey, I already partnered with accountants, and I don't necessarily need to be the owner operator of the accounting firm. But if I already have a process in place, and I already work with accounting firms, and I can convert those clients into wealth management clients, instead of taking years to actually convince a CPA or put a real process in place in an accounting firm that I'm partnered with, I could just buy the actual accounting firm, put the person who's already in charge, or maybe hire an accountant to run it, pay them $150,000, $200,000 a year to actually run the firm on a day-to-day basis. But now those clients work with me for wealth management. It's not necessarily an if, it's part of the whole entire process that they're exposed to. So that has been a very interesting, I think, paradigm that I've seen in the industry, is that I think market multiples for accounting firms are being pushed up. And I don't necessarily, I think it's from accountants, it's actually from wealth managers getting into the space and realizing, hey, I can acquire a business for a much lower multiple and convert that clientele. And hey, as long as someone is owning, right, the accounting firm and operating on a daily basis and still giving those clients a great experience as it relates to tax planning, well, that still seems to make sense in the industry. So I don't know if you've seen that, Saul, at all, but it's definitely been very interesting development to see over the last few years.
Do you want to earn CPE credit? Take this course of MyCPE 1 to earn free credit. Click the link in the description to get started.
No, I completely agree to you. And, I have had wealth management companies also reaching out to me, and they were looking to acquire. And it's a very beautiful growth strategy, right? Because it's not like they were alien to working with CPAs. They have been using them for a lot of their clients. And like you rightly mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, as wealth increases, so does the strategy to effectively manage the tax increase. So it's a very natural fit. And you mentioned about multiples, and that's something that I always love to ask, even in my webinars, even in this podcast. I'm going to ask you this. So when we look at valuations, everyone wants to know, are the multiples holding up? What are the buyers actually prioritizing right now?
Yeah, so I would say the multiples are definitely holding up. I don't necessarily see them vastly increasing here in the short term. I mean, I think they're slightly keying up, but it's mostly due to demand. Now as of today, I think we had an announcement that Powell, may cut interest rates in September, right, which has been obviously top of mind for everybody. And I think the market jumped pretty nicely today. So if that happens, we may see multiples increase a little bit more, obviously, because now it's cheaper to borrow capital, right? And that always factors into the deals and the availability of capital to our buyers. So I think that multiples are going to hold up pretty steadily here over the next few years. Again, I think only there's going to be more increased interest as you have more sellers exiting the business. So I see multiples, holding up and being very healthy. Now, hey, if the market starts to take a little bit of a downturn, right? Nobody has a crystal ball or know what's going to happen over the next few years with the stock market. I've seen that tends to shake out some of the less experienced buyers because they don't run good enough margins, right, to be able to still do M&A at scale, right, when the markets tend to contract a little bit. So that's only the real risk I see in terms of multiples coming down. But I'm a big believer in the short term and the long term that multiples are only going to key up higher and higher as there's more demand in the space.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Thank you for laying that out. Now, from my vantage point, for the firms that I've spoken to and whatever I've seen, read, right, I've seen many firms often walk into the M&A process without preparation, and then they end up leaving money on the table. So what's that one most common pitfall that you see when advisors try to sell without a game plan?
Great question. So on the sell side, I would say that the biggest thing that I see is that it's hard for them to get the data. I'm a big believer in that when you're bringing a business to market, you really need to have all the data prepared. If the buyer has to keep going back to you to get more and more data, and that's elongating the process, and then you're not responsive, that tends to irk, people the wrong way a little bit, because in my opinion, if your mindset is you're going to sell your business, you should have all the data ready to go, right? And you should be responsive to the buyer and able to get back to them and give them updates when needed. At the end of the day, there's a lot of minutia involved with looking at all this data, right? Number of clients, what the clients are invested in, right? If the seller is changing firms to the buyer's firm, there may be a product portability exercise that we have to go through to make sure that all the products are portable to the buyer's firm. And I've noticed that when the seller comes to the table with incomplete data, ultimately, it just results in a decreased valuation because buyers tend to get frustrated and you're wasting essentially time throughout the process. And that tends to, I think, decrease, right, the value of the practice. So that's really the main thing I see is really just getting the data ready. And now on the opposite side of the coin, the buy side, I'm a big believer, and I always coach advisors on this, is that you have to build scale proactively to attract a seller, right? If I'm speaking with you, Saul, and everything is reactive, I'm trying to convince you that I'm a good buyer for your business, but I'm only going to hire somebody unless we do the deal. Everything is contingent on us actually doing something. That's not the feeling that is going to make a seller feel comfortable to actually want to sell, for me to sell your business to you, right, in this example. So I always coach advisors to say, listen, if you're telling me your goal is to close on 4 or 5 deals over the next 3 or 4 years, you need to hire people now. You need to build scale now so that when you meet a seller, they look at you and they say, wow, Saul has everything built. He has junior advisors on his team. He has capital to invest. He has systems set up to actually do this, right? Ideally, he's done a few deals before, so this is not his first rodeo. He understands how to actually acquire a financial services business, and he's experienced in doing that. Again, when it's a reactive situation, you're just subtly telling and subliminally telling the seller on the other end of the meeting that you're really not that qualified to actually buy their business. So I see that as a big hurdle on the buy side. It's the unwillingness to invest in scale. And if you think about the life cycle of scaling a business, it's not necessarily just an exponential growth, right? You have growth, but then you plateau. And then when you plateau, you have to invest capital to then get to that next level, right? It becomes almost like a chunky little graph, right? Because you have a plateau, you invest, and then you scale again. And I think the advisors that, again, they say they want to do M&A, but they're not actually willing to put the dollars behind it to make the transaction a success. It simply just becomes a pipe dream. And those advisors, respectfully, are not winning the deals out there that we're seeing. So.
Wow, I really love that. I really love that. In fact, you have probably said something that I always tell that, you got to make sure of this. Okay. I've heard advisors making mistakes on this. So many horror stories. You talked about Todd. Todd has been kind enough to also share some of these horror stories of the mistakes that advisors have made. So, I couldn't thank you enough for sharing that advice for everybody who's listening to the podcast. Now, let's talk about your partnerships, right? CPA partnerships have been the central to your success, but they're still overlooked by many advisors. Why do you think that is?
Great question. I would say the average financial advisor, and again, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, financial advisors type A, average accountant is more introverted, right, and analytical. Financial advisors get very frustrated, right? Because they look at an accountant and they don't get it, right? They say, I don't understand why they don't see the opportunity. There's all this money we can make, and there's so much opportunity within your client base, right? And hey, you charge a client $400 for a tax return, and I would charge that same client $2,000, right, to manage their money at 1%. Why don't you understand that? And they just get very frustrated. But the reality is that they're just not willing to put in the time to build a relationship. At the end of the day, accountants are very slow move in general, right? They're very slow moving. They're very methodical. They have to think through things very, tactfully, right? They don't really make rash decisions or move quickly. So I think the average financial advisor who prospects accountants does not internalize that. I mean, literally, so my best accounting relationships that I built in Cut and Wealth, I didn't get some of my first referrals from them until 2 years after I met them. Think about that. 2 years after I met them. I was driving to the office. I was having breakfast with them, coffee. We were doing meetings. I was educating them on what we do and our process and how we manage money for clients. But that's the reality. I mean, an accountant is not going to feel comfortable in the short term. So I think the main pitfall for advisors is they're just not patient, right? They get frustrated. They don't understand why the accountant doesn't look at it the way they do. But you really have to put yourselves in an advisor in the accountant's shoes, right? And understand how they work and how they look at things. And I'm a big believer, and part of my coaching process when I did a lot of coaching with John was, don't assume that an accountant knows what you do, right? A lot of advisors, right? Accountants are smart people, right? They're really good at what they do, but don't assume that they know what a financial advisor does, right? Because the reality is, if you're speaking with a 55, 60-year-old accountant, maybe younger, maybe a little bit older, right? They probably have had situations where their clients have had really bad experience with financial advisors, right? Maybe they were being churned, right? Hey, the financial advisor surrendered an annuity and caused the client a tax issue. Hey, they have a $1 million portfolio with 400 positions in it, and they're not even working together. It's just a bunch of junk in the portfolio, and there's no alpha in the portfolio, right? It's just a BS portfolio, for lack of a better term. So I understand that, right? Accountants listening to this podcast, trust me, you have seen that. So I think financial advisors also need to understand and really be realistic about it to say, the average accountant doesn't really think that highly of financial advisors. I mean, I think you need to internalize that, right? So you have to be willing to educate them. And part of my process when I coach a lot of advisors was to say, again, don't assume they know what you do. Show them what you do. Create a 10-slide deck on what you actually walk a client through when they're in your office. Don't assume they know. Show it to them, because when you show it to them, it starts to kind of make sense in their head. And then they start to think, hey, I just met Sally Smith last week and she had an issue with her advisor. Maybe you would be a good fit to meet them. But if you don't show them what you do and you assume that they know what you do, you're just always going to be at that step one, and you're never going to be able to actually, work your way into your first referral and really get a chance to prove yourself with that account.
Brilliant. And for advisors, you mentioned about accountants, and for advisors who are actually listening to this podcast and who are thinking about building these partnerships, right? What are the key factors they need to get right to ensure it's mutually beneficial?
Yeah, great question. So number one, they have to have the time to meet accountants. We used to coach kind of like a 4 or 5 step process, through meeting an accountant to actually, solidify some level of buy-in from them. So don't think that you're just going to do 1 or 2 meetings with them and that you're going to get a referral, right? I mean, that's not the reality of it. You have to be willing to build a long-term relationship with them. And you cannot lead with money. I want to be very clear about this to the advisors listening in. That's not attractive to an accountant. They are not doing anything that they're doing now for the money, right? Obviously, we're in business. We're in America. We're all in business to make money. But we're not working with their clients to make money. It's to get them better outcomes. When you're successful in business, when you help people, the money follows, right? It's not about the money first. If you do right in business, the money's there anyway, right? So I think a lot of advisors need to understand that, is that you're not going to wow an accountant with a paycheck, with all the opportunity. You're going to wow them by showing them that you're actually a credible financial advisor that has a real process, a real system, and that you actually do right by your clients. That's step one. You have to build trust with them. Once you build trust with them, they have to like you. And then once they like you, then you can do some business together. I feel like a lot of advisors, again, they just move too quickly, or they get that first referral and they're like, oh my God, this is so great. I can pay you on this. Let's do all this business together. And the accountant's like, oh my God, what did I just get myself involved with? I don't ever want to see you again, right? And that's when they stop answering your emails, they stop answering your phone calls, and the advisor's like, what did I do wrong? you acted too quickly, right? My old boss used to say, you smelled the blood in the water and you went right for the kill. That's not what you're supposed to do. You almost want to take that referral and say, listen, I want to make sure that this is going to be a right fit for us. Push back on it a little bit. That shows that, hey, you're looking to do this for the right reasons. So yeah, hopefully I'm not going too long-winded here, but you got to put in the time and you have to lead with the process and the relationship with the client, not the money. The second that you make it about the money when it shouldn't be about the money, that's when the CPA, you never hear from them again and you're going to wonder why, and that's why.
Well, I love it. And, well, folks, you heard it from Joe. Don't become I don't know, I think I remember it was Cuba Gooding Jr. in Jerry Maguire talking to Tom
Perfect.
Cruise. Show me the money.
Yes.
Don't go with that. All right. Don't go with that. All right. I love it. All right. And, since we're talking movies, I'd really love to hear a story here. Can you share an example where a CPA partnership really unlocked growth for an advisory practice?
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of examples there. We've been able to build some really great CPA relationships, at Cut and Wealth that have referred us business owner clients. And as you know, Saul, that's, really where, some of the wealthy clients are. A lot of their wealth is inside their business. It's not necessarily in investable assets. So while those clients tend to be a little bit of a longer play, eventually when they sell that business, if you could be the benefactor of those assets, that really is where I think the opportunity is on the financial advice side. So there's been a lot of opportunities where we've, been very patient with accountants, right? Worked with them for 5, 6, 7 years, and lo and behold, when one of their biggest clients sells the business, we've put in that time and that effort so that guess what? We get that referral, and now we have multi-millions of dollars to manage for them, and that becomes a very fruitful relationship. I actually have a great story too. I had a CPA who was part of a networking group with a financial advisor. And because we had a great referral relationship, he basically told me, Joe, I have someone in my networking group who's looking to sell his advisory practice, right? So that was introduced to me. And then that essentially became a wealth management M&A opportunity because we did right by the accountant, right? We had a good client service process in place with them. And they knew we were credible. And then I got that referral to the selling advisor on the financial side. We were able to execute on that transaction. So, I think Saul really just comes back to just being a good business person, right? Leading with good things, the laws of reciprocity, right? If I do right by you, right, you do right by me, etc. I think if you just follow that in business and just be a good business person, again, the opportunities will follow, but you got to be patient, right? You can't be jumping out of your seat to work with an accountant. You can't get impatient with them. You can't be rash with them. They're very slow moving folks, and that's okay, but you just have to understand that, and you have to put yourself in their shoes, and you just have to move slowly throughout the process. And I promise you, if you're willing to put in the time, you're willing to court them a little bit, you're willing to wow them a little bit, right, with some random acts of kindness or some things that we used to teach, you will get the referral. And then once you get that referral, you got to prove yourself. Once you prove yourself, then you can slowly move to that next step and start to kind of increase your relationship currency with them throughout the process.
Well, Joe, I don't know what to say, but, this podcast is turning out to be, I don't know, gospels of truth for a lot of advisors, right? Because, I mean, look, it's fascinating because, I've been working with a lot of CPAs, and I find it really fascinating that CPAs often hold the trust of a lot of business owners and in some cases also high net worth clients. And yet, many advisors still don't fully tap into that bridge because they're not able to see this relationship the way you're putting it across. Because if they're able to really just grasp the things that you said in this podcast, clearly, and then they went to talk to a CPA who is in that position, good clientele, the upside is massive. So,
Huge. Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm actually I'm glad you said that. I'll just take a little aside on that for a second. So I've seen some studies on that, and the CPA, CPAs listening to this or accountants, you are the most trusted advisor in the room, right? You may not believe it, but the reality is you are. I've even seen a study where I think that the average business owner trusts their CPA more than their doctor, right? I mean, you literally are the go-to to a client's financial life. So again, to kind of take a step back, you owe it to yourself, right? If you're working with a financial advisor, trust me, ask the hard questions. Do more due diligence, right? Push them back, etc. You want to make sure that they're the right person to work with, because the reality is, and again, a lot of this is part of what I used to coach advisors on, is that, like you said, so that's the opportunity. They hold, right, that influence over their client, but a lot of times they just don't think it's their place to actually make the recommendation, right? Hey, I only do taxes. I don't want to introduce a financial advisor. That's not my path. I don't want anything bad to happen to my client. But, again, if you actually take the time to do due diligence and partner, right, with a quality advisor, right, who's going to do right by your clients, the opportunity literally is endless. And, as well as anybody, Saul, if one of your best clients who has been with you for 30 years, right, maybe they started the business years ago, it's a great business now, and you've helped them all throughout that process. If you say, Saul, you built a great business. I really have a great resource for you that I want you to meet. I really think we should all set up some time to meet over the next few weeks. I think you'd find a lot of value in this. That client is not going to say no. They're going to say, Saul, whatever you think, you've helped me get to this point so far. So it's almost like that's the game, for lack of a better term. You have to figure out how to unlock that. And part of that is obviously getting the CPA's conviction, right, that you are the right advisor to be able to meet that client. It takes years. Trust me, advisors, it takes a long time. But once you get there, that is kind of the promised land and the magic bullet, if that makes sense.
Yep, fingers crossed. Now let's shift to succession, right?
Sure.
I mean, like a lot of advisors, they wait until the last minute to plan their exit. So in your view, when should they realistically start?
Yes, great question. So I would say they should probably start planning 2 to 3 years at least in advance. And the reason why I say that is I think a lot of advisors, when you sell an advisory business, you don't just egg. I mean, listen, there may be a health concern or a compliance issue or things like that, where maybe that actually, unfortunately, has to be the case. But most of the deals that we help get to the finish line, the advisor is staying on for at least 12 months anyway, right? So it's not necessarily the right time to address it 1 year before you're actually willing to completely leave the industry. You don't have enough time at that point, right? Because any buyer usually wants the advisor to stay on for at least 12 months to fully transition those client relationships, fully transition that trust over to the buyer. If I just send my client a letter and tell them that I'm retiring, see you later, you're in good hands with Saul, that client's not staying with you. I mean, that was not a proper transition or a proper conversation to have with a client who's worked with you for 20 years. And throughout these deals, there's always an attrition component of it, right? If clients leave the buyer, right, the seller's not getting the full sale price, we're prorating some of those future payments. So you have to make sure not only do you have the right buyer, but that you're willing to stay on for the proper amount of time to transition the clients. And, better buyers, you don't necessarily need to be on for 12 months. But if you have a big business, you should be willing to stay on for at least 12 months because it's absolutely going to be in your best interest.
Well, I love that. And so what are the critical steps that ensure a smooth and profitable transition?
Yep. So I would say the first step is getting in the mindset of actually selling the business. I understand, right? It's a very big decision for an advisor, but I speak with a lot of advisors sometimes where they kind of flip-flop. Is this the right time? Is it not the right time? The market's at all-time highs. Maybe I should wait, right? So I would say that you just really need to be in the mindset to say, hey, I had a conversation with my family, come September 1st, 2028, I am fully retired, and I'm working backwards from that goal to figure out how I can make that a reality. So I would say the first step is you just need to be mentally committed to sell your business. The second step is you need to get the data ready. As we said before, the data is going to be integral. We want to make sure that data is completely accurate. We have all the data that the buyer needs to see. And then the third step, I would say, maybe a shameless plug, but hire a qualified consultant. Just like if you were to sell a house, you're probably not selling it without a real estate agent. I mean, that's the reality of it. You do not know essentially what's out there. And I'll say that nicely, right? You only have one shot to sell your business and retire. So you really owe it to yourself to make sure that, not only do you find the right buyer and you're working with someone who's qualified, but you have a sounding board or an intermediary in between you both that you can bounce ideas off of that's directly incented to make sure that not only you get the highest sale price possible, but you actually find the right buyer who's going to give your clients a good experience. So I always recommend don't go about it alone. I mean, listen, you can, but I've seen too many horror stories with, sellers not hiring, right, a business broker or a consultant to sell their business. And then, it doesn't really necessarily turn out for them and they don't get the full sale price. So I would say in general, those are the 3 steps. And a firm like ours can obviously help you walking along the process, help negotiate the deal, put the paperwork in place, et cetera. That's essentially what we do.
Yep. And I would just want to probably add one more. I mean, I'm actually stealing it from somebody else. Brandon Poe, he's also somebody who advises a lot of CPA firms with buying and selling. And I read one of his books, and the very first thing he says is perspective. Put yourself in perspective. What are you going to be doing after you exited? Get that perspective right, So
Oh man,
very, very
so that.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
You know.
yeah, and I'll make a point on that. It's definitely an exercise that we go through. When you've done something for 30 years, longer, maybe a little bit less, it becomes your identity, right? It's what you do every
Yes.
day. And, for a lot of financial advisors, it becomes their hobby. They're not necessarily working 60 hours a week anymore when they first started their career to build the business. Maybe they come in the office 20, 25 hours a week. It's fun for them at this point. So when that's the
Yes.
case, it becomes very hard for them to detach from it because they don't really necessarily see themselves retiring. They can't paint that vision in their head. So that's actually an exercise that we go through when we engage sellers, is to say, what does retirement look like for you? Are you traveling to Europe? Are you going on the boat? Are you playing golf? Are you spending time with kids and the grandkids? What does that look like for you? And sometimes when a seller can't paint that vision to me, I know that it's going to be hard for them to eventually let go of that practice, right? But when somebody says, you know what, Joe, I'm going to be on the boat, me and my wife are going to take some trips to Europe, that's when I know that they're actually committed to sell their business because they painted that vision in their head. And by the way, we help them with that, right? It's actually part of our process. I don't want to say it's almost the therapy part of the process, but it becomes sometimes almost that. But that's the reality. You said it, so if they can't visualize that transaction becomes a lot harder because that almost tells me that they're not really ready, or they're just not, they don't have enough interests or activities to kind of enjoy themselves in retirement. And we almost have to give them those activities to say, well, hey, why don't you do this? What are you going to be doing with your life? The more that we can get them granular on that and kind of paint that vision for them, the more likely they are to actually sell the business.
Well, although you say that, it's not really therapy, but it feels like it. And it is actually kind of like a therapy because it's very emotional as well, right? You built a business for a long time and now you're going to be exiting out of it. So it
Of
can
course.
be, it's highly emotional. So I completely agreed with you on everything that you said. Now, we talked about where we are today. We talked about, how we'll plan a succession. Let's look ahead. Looking ahead, what are the trends what trends should advisors and CPA firm owners be aware of that could really impact their exit strategies in the next few years?
Yeah, great question. So, obviously we have the markets, right, working in our favor or not, right? That's always the big question. Obviously markets are pretty much at all-time highs now. So what I usually tell people when I speak with them is candidly, not a bad time to explore it, right? Because the valuation at this point, as it's based on the market, will probably be pretty high, right? Depending on whatever happens in the future. So, that's what I would say would be number one. Number two is private equity. I think private equity has come pretty heavy-handed into the space. And I think that's drastically changing the landscape here. It already has, and I think it will into the future on private equity, either doing some of these deals directly or buyers being, backed by private equity or private credit so that they now have more capital to be able to do deals and pay higher multiples. So I think that is going to come into play. So I would say if you own a bigger business, right, over 100 million or so of AUM or larger, you're probably being prospected by someone who has some private equity backing or not. And, we can help you with that if needed. But the reality is bigger businesses fetch bigger multiples, right? And more likely private equity will be interested in a larger business than a smaller business. So that's definitely a trend to be aware of and learn about and kind of understand, the pitfalls and the benefits of dealing with a private equity or a private credit back buyer. But other than that, I think we pretty much see business as usual. The good news about financial services M&A is that, again, like I said before, it's more about the relationship than the transaction. But the interesting part is it's very intangible, right? We're only really selling a book of business. It's a name of clients that you've worked with for 30 or 40 years that just implicitly trust you to do right by them. So it's interesting, but it's also a little bit scary, right? Because we're not necessarily selling inventory or overhead or products, et cetera. It really is just an intangible book of business. So because of that, it's very relationship driven. So I think over the next few years, you're going to see some developments in that, whether it be AI for negative or for positive, right? Depending on how the industry kind of shakes out with that. But I'm still a big believer in the best way to understand someone is to meet with them, either over a virtual meeting or in person, get them to paint their vision behind their succession plan. And if you feel like you can help them, insert a few quality options and be along with them throughout the process. I don't think that core process is really going to change much over the next 10 years.
Well, I love when you mentioned AI because this is one industry. It's so much relationship driven. I pray that AI does not take over it. Sure, you can use AI for maybe the other stuff, the behind the scenes stuff, the financial due diligence and the legal due diligence, or maybe just all the other things, the documentation and all that. But I would still want this to be this the business in which you are meeting people, a human to human interaction. I would
Right.
I would love it to be there. So let's keep our
So
fingers crossed on that.
I think one thing people don't understand with AI, and it's very funny, is that sure, AI can crunch the numbers, it can give you a game plan, it can give you the next steps, but it can't replicate you engaging a client
Yes.
through a life event, right? That's something that AI, it doesn't feel emotion, right? So Saul, if I helped you when your grandmother died and through that inheritance process and through that estate settlement and getting you over that and kind of framing the next steps for you, a robot can't do that. It doesn't feel emotion or
Yes.
compassion, right? So when
Yeah.
I bring you through a life event like that, our relationship is on a different level, right? You value me a lot more because, hey, I helped you when there was a family passing, an inheritance, maybe you moved from state to state and we helped you sell a property or real estate, etc. So that's one thing I think that a lot of people miss is that, yeah, AI, it's efficient, it helps you, it saves you time, etc. But if I brought you through a major life event and I was the person who was there for you, a robot can never replicate that, right? Human emotion is something that can never be replicated, in my opinion, at least. Knock on wood, I guess we'll see what happens over the next, 20 or 25
Yep.
years or so. But I think that's the missing piece here is that a lot of advisors are scared by AI. But again, I would really encourage you to just reflect on all the clients that you've helped through very hard times and those thank yous that you got from them. It's, financial advice and accounting and things like that. I don't think that AI is essentially going to be able to get in the way of you helping another human get through a life event. So I hope that makes sense.
Yep. I agree to you, man. So, folks, AI can just sound more human, but it can never be a human being. All right. So, all right, make note of that. With that, Joe, this has been an insightful conversation. So, for our listeners who are thinking about selling, merging, or growing their firm through acquisitions, what's the best way to get in touch with you and your team?
Absolutely. So you can reach me directly at my office at area code 516-265-1410. You can send me an email at Joseph, Joseph, at eliteconsultingpartners.com, all one word. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/in/Joseph M. Greco. M is in Michael.
All right, this is great. We are definitely going to be leaving obviously the phone numbers and emails. We want to keep it limited to the people who are listening to the podcast, but we'll definitely share your LinkedIn in the show notes as well. So that's also one way, as well as your website as well. So people have an access to that. And with that, this has been fantastic. So Joe, thank you so much for joining me. And for our listeners, if you are enjoying these conversations, don't forget to subscribe to Accounting M&A Insider. Until next time, I'm Saul, reminding you that in M&A, preparation and partnerships make all the difference. Till next time, take care. Have a blessed day. Cheers.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE One Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now